Common Good Daily podcast. It's Monday, April 12th, and today we're going to be talking about what hope we can find for our situation today from the spirituality of Desmond Tutu. Now, on Mondays, we often take a look at what's happening in the news and try to arrange our lives, try to arrange our passions, try to arrange our essence to say, what could we do as people for the common good to pursue a life that would connect with what's happening in the news. And I'll tell you, for a lot of us, we feel like there is a struggle afoot in our society and all around the world. And it's not only a new one, it's one that's been going on for a long time. And so today we're going to talk about how other people who have gone before us, specifically Desmond Tutu, how his life and his spirituality led him and has led him to be a person who was raising his voice, not only in South Africa in the 1980s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and continuing to do so today, but how that can be instructive for us. So we are joined by the Rev Michael Battle, and we'll talk to him in a minute. I'm in Minneapolis. We'd love to hear where you're from. I'm standing up today. So let us know in the comments if you're watching on the social streams where you're coming from, what it is that you're doing. And Michael, good to see you. Thank you for the book that you have written on Desmond Tutu, a spiritual biography of a South Africa's confessor. It's so good to see you. And as we were talking before we came on, you are in New York City.
I am. And thanks, Doug, for having me on your podcast.
Well, you are sure welcome. All right. So Michael, for people who don't know Desmond Tutu, now that might seem, a little shocking to someone who has been his friend as you have for so long and have been a biographer of his, and I think following in his lineage. Can you give us a little bit of a description of who Desmond Tutu is and what his contribution has been to
Sure.
the world that we have? For people's name, his name might be familiar, but they have a hard time sort of connecting him to the realities of what's happening in the world.
Sure. Part of his spirituality is that he is disarming and he naturally fades into the background. He does that kind of work, I think really because of his trainings. Early Christian monks that came out of England, the community of the resurrection, trained him. So Tutu's kind of like Batman. Batman goes away and then you have these monks who train him. Well, Tutu had a very similar kind of training early on. He as a child, was sickly, and he grew up under the care of such monks. He became famous in 1984 when he won the Nobel Peace Prize. The 80s were a critical time in South Africa's history as the anti-apartheid movement gained full strength to resist the nationalism and to resist the Afrikaners National Party, which created apartheid as a government policy. And then from the 80s, he became Archbishop of the province of all of Southern Africa. So he was a pivotal figure in the institutional Anglican Church. And once Nelson Mandela was elected president, Tutu wanted to fade back into and recede back into his life as a church leader. But Nelson Mandela wanted him to chair what I think is one of the most profound experiments for a nation state. Tutu chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which the United States needs as well. And then that occurred in the 90s. And as the 90s have moved into the 2000s, Tutu has become more of an elder. And thank God he's still living with us. But his sort of activist role, because of his age and because of COVID-19, really has slowed down.
So, Michael, you have written this book, Desmond Tutu, a spiritual biography of South Africa's confessor, and it's by your own admission in the introduction, you're advocating for his way of spirituality, right? Like you're not just a biographer standing back saying, "Let me tell you the details" as an objective observer. Your connection to Desmond Tutu is personal. As you write in the book, you lived with him in the early 1990s. He married you and your wife. He's baptized your children. Like you are from his stream, right? And and this personal relationship. And so you know something about the man. Um, to set the context for why he was so powerful, can you describe a bit about what apartheid meant and why it was such a scourge on human society? From 1948, I think, till 1991, it was a kind of formal segregation in the country of South Africa that a lot of people. I remember in college. I'm in my early 50s. I remember in college studying apartheid and just sort of being shocked at the level to which apartheid was the separation was taking place in South Africa legally. Like it wasn't like, well, there's racism in South Africa that people wink and nod at. It was the formal governmental structure. So can you describe a bit about what that is to really set the context for how someone like Desmond Tutu became a national leader there, a moral leader, and a world leader?
Sure. Apartheid is a term that comes from the language Afrikaans. And Afrikaans is the language that Afrikaners speak. And the Afrikaners are descendants of the Netherlands. And they came to South Africa as they were seeking opportunities for trade, similar to Europeans who came to North America seeking a new life. Um, the Afrikaners came also pretty much simultaneously with the British, which is a whole nother story. But apartheid is something that the Afrikaners created, and it was created by major Christian leaders who became the prime ministers and presidents, seminarians from the Dutch Reformed Church. And apartheid, in many ways, means to be holy, to be set apart.
Mm.
And so Afrikaners saw themselves in many ways as holy, as set apart, um, as above the other cultures of South Africa. Um, let's keep in mind, Doug, I know this narrative of apartheid really makes the Afrikaners look bad, but the British were really no better. The British
Mm.
placed Afrikaners in concentration camps at the turn of the 20th century. So you have to keep that in mind as we talk about apartheid. So apartheid, as you correctly say, in 1948, when the Afrikaners took control from the British, the Afrikaners created this system in which what your race was predicted the fullness of your citizenship. So if you
Mm.
were white, you were a full citizen. If you were colored, you were sort of in limbo in terms of your
Mm.
citizenship. You had some rights, but you didn't have as many rights as white identity. And then you had black identity, which in many ways was um, the untouchable
Mm.
uh, category. Um, and so you didn't really have any rights. And in essence, there was a movement to create reservations for
Wow.
Black people to live on their own. So it was a legal system that separated people based on race.
Would that be something similar to the way we think about the indigenous peoples of the United States, that they were given a separate a reservation to live on? Was it similar to that, or was it even more painful and harmful and evil than that?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to say which one was more painful, Doug. I think it is
Mm-hmm.
a combination of what happened to the indigenous people in North America, as well as what I just mentioned, the caste system in
Mm-hmm.
India. I think it was a combination because you had religious elements justifying this categorization of people based on race.
And that's an important part, that for the Dutch church, for the Calvinists, from the reform, the the Dutch Reformed Church, which in the United States, you know, that denomination still exists, that they really were making a theological argument for apartheid. Like it was a religious and political movement, maybe something similar to what we would consider Christian nationalism today. They would sort of combine these together in the United States. So was that a particular reason why, for Desmond Tutu, who was a priest and then a bishop in the Anglican Church, for him to be an alternative voice as a religious person and to suggest an alternative spirituality? Was that important?
Absolutely. The Tutu, unlike leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and others, he did not have a constitution to appeal to have conversations with those in power. His only authority really came with his engagement with this theological meta narrative of what it meant to be a human being. And so his appeal to what was Christian, he made that the argument. Also, it was important also for Tutu because he had international access and he was ecumenical. So he was able to. Another thing I should have said, what was famous for Tutu's leadership is his really Herculean work to bring sanctions onto an apartheid government. So because of his international reach, he was able to do that, unlike most leaders around the world. But it really was absolutely this combination of civil religion that put apartheid in.
Okay, so you are a very accomplished person. You are currently the professor of church and society and director of the Desmond Tutu Center at General Theological Seminary in New York, the Episcopal Church, which for those who don't know, I'll just give this explanation. The Episcopal Church is the brand name of the Anglican Church when it's in the United States. So the Anglicans everywhere else in the world are called Episcopalians here. So you're part of that same tradition of which Desmond Tutu was a part of as an Anglican bishop. And then you have a degree from Duke University, an undergrad, and a master's degree from Princeton Seminary, another master's degree from in sacred theology from Yale, and then a PhD also from Duke. So you're a very accomplished and academically successful person. But that's not really what you root this book in. Like, this book is not really an academic narrative of your story. It's the contemplative spirituality of Desmond Tutu. How did you meet him? And when you lived with him in the early 90s, like, how did that come about? And what in the world was that like, living in South Africa with Desmond Tutu in the early 1990s, right at the crux of the end of the legal apartheid system?
Yeah, Doug, I think you've got good insight. The impetus for me to go to South Africa was to write my dissertation on Tutu. And so when I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed as a young academic, I saw myself going to do what most PhD students are socialized to do some original academic kind of work. But when I got there, and Archbishop Tutu provided me the miracle of living with him during probably this epic, seemingly biblical time before South Africa was going to have its first democratic election, I felt kind of like this biblical writer recording history or something. And so he allowed me to live with him. And so it's not I really like your insight. This is not simply this academic work that I thought I was going to do because I was living with him. As I say in the biography, I am not trying to be so-called objective in my telling of Tutu's life because in living with him, I saw the integrity between his private life and his public life. And it's something that most people don't get to see from major leaders. And so academically, you're supposed to be so-called objective, even though in a postmodern world, that's been debunked, thank God. Right. Nothing is objective. Everything has interpretation and context. but in the context in which I'm able to live with him and to see the source from which he's able to be a public leader, I felt obliged to tell that story, to make it public.
How did he invite you to live with him? I mean, I've got to imagine after him winning the Nobel Peace Prize, he's an internationally famous person. He's so busy trying to lead a church and, usher in Nelson Mandela after his return from prison and bring about sanctions on the country of South Africa. And then a PhD student shows up and says, "Hey, I'm working on a dissertation. Do you think I could get a little time?" Like, how does he end up saying, "Hey, Michael, why don't you come live in the, in the spare bedroom or out in the, let's sleep out on the sofa"? How did that even happen?
Yeah, I'm just as surprised as you are, Doug. The beauty of it, I think, is I was in the ordination process as well, and I was a deacon in the Anglican Church, about to become a priest, and I think that helped me. But I think Tutu saw in me an eagerness, sincerity, and he also realized that I was in the ordination process, so I wasn't simply there just to study him. And where he lived was a place called Bishop's Court, magnificent place, beautiful. And so he was also, this was serendipity, providence, in need of a chaplain. So I was able to de facto be a chaplain, before they actually got a full-time chaplain. So just in terms of my own Christian faith, I saw it as the Holy Spirit bringing together the circumstances to make that miracle happen for me to live with him.
Did you know that was going to happen when you went and visited there, or were you there like on one short visit and then had to come back to the United States and get your affairs in order, or did you just like move in and never come back?
Well, I had an epiphany to do my dissertation on Tutu when I was at Duke, and that's another long story. But Tutu happened to be at Emory on sabbatical at the time, so I drove down. I was just kind of bold, drove down and I asked to have a meeting with Archbishop Tutu, and I pitched like some kind of aspiring Hollywood star going to a director or something. I pitched my my dissertation to him, and the first thing he said was, "Let us pray." And so when he said, "Let us pray," I mean, I was astounded, and I realized, hey, this guy's not really who most people think he is. He actually believes what he's saying. And so that even made me even more stubborn in terms of trying to make all this happen. And so he prayed about it. And then I went over to South Africa, not thinking I was going to live with him. I was just going to live in a youth hostel kind of place and do as much research as I could. But then he invited me to come and live at Bishop's Court. And then I extended all of my visas for 2 years to stay in South Africa.
Well, that's a good day. Hey, were you raised in the Episcopal Church? Are you a lifelong Episcopalian?
I was raised in the National Baptist Church, Martin Luther King Jr.'s denomination.
Okay.
And I was ordained a Baptist minister actually when I was 16 years old, and I became an Episcopalian when I was at Princeton Seminary. I changed to being an Episcopalian then.
That's probably a piece of a story that I would imagine Desmond Tutu was interested in, because he's a curious kind of theological character, right? Like he combined a lot of different streams of Christianity into his theology and into his public advocacy and his public work. Did he find that interesting to have someone from the sort of Black Baptist church tradition now being inside the Anglican tradition of the Episcopal Church and saying, I want to bring some of those pieces together? Did you want that? And did he also see that and want to bring those elements together?
Yeah, I think he was curious around that. I think that's right. I think I was a resource in many ways to him as he was navigating during those high times of apartheid. And, I was a source for him in terms of the culture for the US. But keep in mind, even in South Africa, they had basically the same black folks had basically the same journey. Tutu
Mm.
early on, his father was a Methodist, um, and the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME, was very strong for Tutu growing up. Even though Tutu became an Anglican pretty much um, in his preteen years, so pretty much the same dynamics that I was going
Yeah,
through of
yeah.
navigating the black church and then becoming an Episcopalian and predominantly white church. Tutu similarly had an experience like that too.
I remember hearing about Desmond Tutu when I was early in college and learning about apartheid. I was new to Christianity as a teenager, so I didn't have a lot of history. And he was a character that even back then, people in the religious traditions didn't know if they should trust him. Right? He leaned into black theology, and then some of the more Marxist kinds of theological movements that were coming out of liberation theology didn't think he went far enough. People in the United States were nervous as can be whether he was going to be trustworthy or not because of all the racial implications in the United States. Was it the same way in South Africa? Was there always sort of a cloud of religious and theological concern and misunderstanding surrounding him and trying to pin him down into being in one camp versus the other?
The very same, yes. Um, the suspicions from the black progressive leaders in South Africa were, of course, suspect of this institutional Anglican uh, colonialist church. Um, yeah, and then of course the Dutch Reformed conservatives were suspicious of Tutu's liberal Christianity. Um, yeah, so he was hit from both sides, and also in the U.S. had a hard time. Christian leaders, Jerry Falwell called Tutu a phony, um, and basically President Reagan basically agreed with Falwell's assessment. Um, so the same attacks from both sides occurred from the U.S. towards Tutu as well.
Did that bother him? Did he talk about that? Was he concerned with? I'm thinking about this from the perspective in the United States. There is so much path choosing that religious people do, right? We want to make sure that we're clear and we don't let other people dictate who we are. Like there's just sort of an obsession with leaders here to really stake out your location on the map theologically. Was Tutu concerned about that, or did he seem to have did he find a different way to navigate those issues?
Yeah, I think he understood kind of the genius of being an Anglican. An Anglican is someone who's stereotyped as someone who compromises, who um, is always trying to find a broad way to include people. Is similar to the history of England, who had so many religious wars, and finally they tried to develop a civil religion that could encompass Catholics and Protestants. So Tutu's, and he inherited that kind of via media, that middle way, which can easily look like compromise and sell out for others, try to find ways to include both sides of a conflict.
Desmond Tutu is sort of sits in a lot of people's minds in this little trifecta of people: Nelson Mandela, the Dalai Lama, and Desmond Tutu. Right? There was personal relationship, obviously friendship there. I happened to be at an event in Seattle with Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama and saw their friendship and their deep care for one another. he seems like a very personable and personal leader. Like he's not leading from positional authority. He's leading from this sort of personal charisma and personal ethical care. And we're going to talk a bit, because you write so well about it, about his own spirituality. But is that a right read to say that he his personality and his personal connection to people was what was essential for him?
Yeah, I was a little confused about which person you're speaking to, but this is making a point. I didn't know if you were talking about His Holiness the Dalai Lama or Tutu, because they're very similar. I think both of them speak out of their charisma, out of sort of in medias res, what they're thinking and feeling. Um, they're not, always rehearsing what they're going to say before they say it. They speak out of, who they are and what they're thinking in that moment. So I do indeed think that for Tutu, that's true. It's gotten him into trouble. It's gotten him in trouble in the sense that, he would say what he's honestly thinking in public. And it would get, for those in the ANC, the political party, majority party of Black leaders that Mandela was in, and Mandela himself was oftentimes angry with Tutu by the things he would say. As Tutu would criticize the exorbitant amounts that civil servants and politics were getting while people were living in squalor in townships. Tutu would say that in public. At a major sort of festival where you're supposed to be happy and everything, and some political receptions. And so that would get him in trouble based on, he would say what he actually felt and believed.
The title of your book, Desmond Tutu, A Spiritual Biography of South Africa's Confessor. That word confessor is a particular term. A lot of people might not be familiar with it. What would be another version of that word that confessor sort of grabs, that might be a bit more colloquial, or that people would understand of what you're getting at when you call him South Africa's confessor?
Like spiritual director, or if you think of the Roman Catholic Church or a mafia movie, when somebody goes in to see a Roman Catholic priest to give a confession, the one giving the confession is the confessee. And the priest sitting in that booth, not seeing the person, is the confessor. Yeah, so it's a technical term in theology for the one who receives the confession.
And that was an important function for Desmond Tutu to play as a person. And he embodied that, right? He has this quick laugh, this smile. The cover of the book, if people on the podcast can't see it, it's got that joyous sort of chuckle and full-hearted joy that is so much part of the brand of Desmond Tutu. Like when people would think of him, I'm sure they're thinking of him with that sort of personality. Was that just his temperament, or was this something that was curated because of his spirituality that you write about in the book, from his contemplative? Because you really talk about him as a contemplative, or as a mystic, as a spiritual person who was drawing on some very deep spiritual paths. Is that where that joy came from, or was it a combination that no, he just actually is a fun guy and a fun-loving person, and just it was temperamentally prone to smile?
Yeah, living with Archbishop Tutu and knowing that he wanted silence and quietness behind the scenes, and he prayed probably, and when you were with him out of the public light, he was quiet, even though he had a magnificent sense of humor, but he wasn't, trying to be the life of a party. He was someone who could easily do that, as you could see in his public ministries. But much of his life behind the scenes was contemplative, literally praying 4 or 5 times a day, like a Trappist monk, someone like Thomas Merton. Um, I do think his personality is naturally um, um, extroverted. I do think that. I think, he will naturally control a room, but somehow I think he became someone who learned how to move between extroversion and introversion for the longitudinal health
Hmm.
um, of his leadership. And it's not by accident that he's 89 years old, even though he didn't think he would be living that long based on the threats to his life. But it's not by accident that you live that long with the quality of his life without becoming ambidextrous between being an extrovert and introvert.
Did he talk about that component of what fueled his life to other religious leaders or to other activists? Because he was constantly and still is surrounded by people who are trying to find their own voice in this world, trying to find their own way to influence the world as faith people or as activists. Did he actively encourage people to develop a spiritual practice? For him, it came out of the Christian tradition, and obviously he's an ecumenical person, so he knows that the Dalai Lama organizes and roots himself in a different tradition. But was that something that he was really advocating for, or did he just let that fact of his own deep spirituality and daily commitment just sort of be in his biography?
Yeah, I think, Doug, you got to keep in mind that he was an archbishop. So every day he was holding his clergy accountable.
Mm.
So, if he
Mm.
saw clergy acting out or not demonstrating a prayerful life, um, or clergy burning out, acting out, he would call them into the principal's office. And, he would have a word with them about their spiritual life, if they're saying their prayers. Um, so, that was his job. That was Tutu's job, to require of his clergy to pray. And he saw that as one of his main
Mm.
tasks
Mm.
because, he understood that if you didn't have that life of prayer, you wouldn't have much of a quantity of life,
Mm.
but and you certainly wouldn't have much of a quality of life, because living in an hypocrisy, you are dangerously hurting other people and hurting yourself. So he did require that of others, and he did speak to that, but mostly he did that as an archbishop with his own
I see.
clergy.
He
That
didn't.
took
He
most of
didn't.
his time.
He didn't talk
Yeah.
about that so much in his public spaces when he would be in public talking to fellow advocates who were trying to push for the same causes that he was. He wasn't one who was, um, or was he saying to people, "Hey, it's important, just like for clergy, that all of us root ourselves in a life giving tradition of some kind."
Yeah, he would, of course, say that to leaders in the apartheid government who were self-avowed church um, attenders,
Mm-hmm.
self-avowed Christians. He would appeal to their integrity if they believed in God. Why are you implementing policies the way you are? Why do you say what you say if you really believe we're made in the image of God? So he would appeal to another leader's spirituality,
Nice.
especially in overt situations of injustice. Um, and he would also just say in public that prayer is important. When he led the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a government political secular commission, he would say, let's stop and say the Lord's Prayer. I mean, so
Mm-hmm.
and he wasn't just saying it, he would model it. He would model it. And for those of us who believe in the separation of church and state, we would, be astounded at what he would do in terms of bringing his own Christian spirituality into a secular sphere.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa remains as one of the great accomplishments of the 20th century of humanity's response to its history, right? It's talked about a lot. It's seen as a real model. There's a number of efforts that I know of in the United States that people are trying to base something similar on from our own history of racism and slavery and treatments of indigenous peoples, as well as what's gone on in the last number of years with insurrectionists and Christian nationalists and so on. So it's really seen as a success story, along with a few others around the world. He was instrumental in it. What wasn't he? I mean, I know that Nelson Mandela really wanted it to happen, but asking Desmond Tutu to lead it, his fingerprints were an important part of its success and of anyone knowing about it. Is that fair to say?
Definitely, yeah. He was the symbol for South Africa's anti-apartheid movement for quite a while, especially while the Black political leaders were put in prison. So Tutu became a trusted figure, a trusted voice, and white and Black South Africans trusted him. And so at that time, when Mandela came out of prison and became president, Mandela wanted a truth commission. And naturally, F.W. de Klerk, who was the previous Afrikaner president, naturally, he wanted a reconciliation commission. You understand the motivations for both of them, right? I mean, de Klerk didn't want a truth commission,
Right.
and Mandela didn't just want some kind of wishy-washy reconciliation commission. So in the wisdom of Mandela, he agreed to a truth and reconciliation commission. And really the only figure, because of Tutu's role fighting apartheid, the only one who could really pull that off was Tutu. And it was important because, if you didn't have that opportunity for those who committed atrocious acts to talk about them, confess them in public, the cycles of abuse would still be continuing. But if you say it in public, what you did, you're in effect exorcising demons and stopping family systems of cycles that just are repeated in clandestine ways. That's the reason I think the United States, because we're doing the same thing, we keep, it's like a virus, it's like COVID-19. We keep bringing back acts of violence because we've never resolved some people call it the original sin and in the Americas, but we've never resolved some acts that set our democracy in motion, horrendous acts to set this nation state up. I do want to say that Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, I think, is distinct. There have been other Truth and Reconciliation Commissions around the world, but this is the only one really where amnesty was the priority in a sense of restorative justice. Amnesty was actually given. This is not simply to the military. This is to anyone who would come between 1960 and 1994 and give a public confession of their political crime. They could be given amnesty, not just the military, not just a political leader. Anyone based on what they did that resulted in crimes against the state could be given amnesty. And that is unique. um,
Wow.
compared to the other Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that have occurred.
Was that something highly supported by Desmond Tutu? Was that like that is a shocking notion in our world, right? Because for a lot of us, we want truth and reconciliation so people get what's coming to them, not so that people will receive amnesty and that there'll be a restorative nature to whatever justice narrative is underway. What was that his thing? Was he supportive of that? Was he where was he on that relationship?
Yeah, definitely. He really pushed that aspect of amnesty. Um, he was trying to distinguish between what happens usually in criminal justice of retribution, and retribution never is retribution. I mean, how do you equate um, sitting around barbecuing, um, having a picnic, while at the same time you're putting a black body on a pit and basically cremating? You could see the black body burning, and you're at the same time having a picnic on the other side. How do you bring retributive justice to that? How do you match justice with such a tragic affliction? So retributive justice, is not something that actually rationally can occur. You cannot bring the equivalent justice to an act like that. So restorative justice is, first of all, acknowledging that no retribution can truly take place in certain acts that have occurred. And
Oh, wow.
you know, Doug, some of those tragic stories. But restorative justice can keep us out of the quagmire of nation states that stay stuck in violence, that stay stuck in some points you forget what is occurring in the cycles of violence, as in the Middle East and so on, Syria, and the work that we have is to be conscious of what has occurred. And restorative justice makes us more and more conscious of what has happened so that we can put in place measures to at least resist the, the natural effect of violence.
That is so brilliantly said. Is that part of the work that you do at General Theological Seminary in the Desmond Tutu Center? Like, is that what? Talk a little bit about what you do at the center and how it relates to your understanding of Desmond Tutu.
Yes, so thanks for this opportunity to sort of pitch my commercial.
Yeah,
Yes,
please.
so we we here at General Theological Seminary have um, an institute, a Desmond Tutu Institute center that he gave us in the early 2000s. He gave his name to an institute, a center, and we are trying to present programs that are in Tutu's legacy, such as restorative justice, prison ministries, um, and trying to also go and do pilgrimage to those places in the world that show restorative justice. So I would take groups in August and in January to South Africa, and we would go around and witness and meet political leaders, spiritual leaders who are modeling restorative justice. Of course, with the pandemic, I haven't been able to do that in the past year. But that's one of the main things we do is we do these pilgrimages, travel seminars. And I'm also trying to present content such as books, periodicals. I want to emulate you, Doug, and get a podcast that is structured around
Please.
restorative justice. And also the Tutu Center is trying to make sure that Tutu's legacy, as we started out our conversation, um, is held up because he's not the kind of person who is going to be trying to toot his own horn.
Yeah, it's going to require a real commitment for people to look at the whole life of Desmond Tutu. It's not uncommon for all of us to sort of want the results of any process or system that we think highly of, and not always want to put the framework together that produces that outcome. I feel like your book, now there's a lot of books about Desmond Tutu, right? He's a well biographed person, if biographed is a word. All right. There's kids versions of books that people might read in school. There's big biographies. Yours feels a little different, not only because it's personal and you have this personal connection, but other books seem to talk about like Desmond Tutu as a person, and his spirituality is a part of that. But your book feels like it centers around understanding him and these experiences through this contemplative, almost mystical version of spirituality, which for a lot of people seems really strange for like political public activists, right? They don't often put those two things together in a way that Desmond Tutu did. Is that partly why you wrote the book? And do you think there is indeed something unique about this perspective that would be very helpful for people who are trying today in the world that we live in to find a way of sustainable life and political, social, civic action?
I do. I think the lessons learned in this biography that I wrote on Tutu is really for everyone. You know, if you are a white collar worker, if you are an essential worker, if you are someone who's trying to get a job, you know, the lesson learned about spirituality, that is the purpose of your life, is a very important practice. It's a practice. To have a purpose in life takes practice and habit. And I think that's what I was trying to articulate in this biography, that, you know, we have to focus on what we are naming as our purpose in life and practice it. And our main purpose in life is not really those things that we give as labels to ourselves: a white collar worker, or a essential worker, or being famous or not being famous. You know, the main thing about human identity is that we are invaluable. There is no no limit really to our identity. And for those who believe in God, we use terms like spirituality to define that invaluable nature. But that still takes practice. It takes practice to have that kind of self-esteem, to believe that you are invaluable. And so I think the lessons translate into the everyday world, that, you know, saying your prayers every day, or at least meditating every day, or at least being aware every day, practicing awareness every day that you matter. And those kinds of habits will create and accumulate into longitudinal or long-lasting ways in which we not only have quantitative or numerous productive moments in our life, but it's qualitative. It's having a good life. When all is said and done, and we look back on our life, we can say it is good. It doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes, but we can say at least we at one point came to the conclusion that I matter and this world matters.
And you describe in the book how Desmond Tutu did that. I was a bit taken back by, like, he gets up at 4 a.m. and then prays for a while, and then it like goes on a walk, and then does a devotion and a prayer meeting all before breakfast, and you know, spends hours in the day
like the
sort of
Marines.
And I'm literally, you know, reading that while, you know, it's early in the morning, and I've got MSNBC on TV and I'm listening to that, and I'm going to go on a walk, but I'm going to put my headphones in and listen to a podcast about stuff. And it's easy to think, well, boy, Desmond Tutu didn't have to pull off what he did, with all the distractions we have now, but there were plenty of distractions in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, as today. So that level of commitment is, it's astounding. You talk in the book that you want him to be approached with a sainthood sort of capacity that we recognize him. Tutu is famous for wanting everyone to be seen as saints, right? He wanted sainthood to be the call of humanity, not the call of the elites. But boy, he practiced something with a real level of commitment. Was that intimidating for you as a young PhD student? Like when you were living with him, was it like, oh my gosh, this guy's up at 4 a.m. and I don't know how I would do it. How did that all strike you? His unbelievable passion and commitment for this contemplative and mystical way of doing his spirituality.
Scared to death, dog. I was scared to death of this model and how he could now see my own hapless ways of trying to practice the spiritual life. There was a story that he was called out of morning prayer. We would have morning prayer between like 7:30 in the morning and 8 together, his staff. We were doing morning prayer and he was called out and he told me to come with him. And we got in the car, and Tutu really did have faith because he let me drive him around on the left side of the road, the wrong side of the road.
Right,
and as I was driving him to this a tragic scene of a church that was bombed, we were driving on the road, he just picked up where we left off at morning prayer, because morning prayer has a set liturgy, and he picked off where we left off, expecting me to do the same. And of course, I was using the excuse I was driving. I couldn't really remember what the psalm was, and that. So that just showed you that the hardest thing for Tutu was to say his prayers every day. Really, literally, I think spiritually, that was the hardest thing. It wasn't to get up and sway the masses or to speak to the Queen or to try to make policy. The hardest thing was for him to say his prayers every day. And I think he didn't really judge me or judge others because he was so hard. It was so hard for him to judge himself. And so the reason that I make that claim about being a saint is because whether he likes it or not, he's a model that this world really needs. And I know that it's not democratically correct to call any person a saint, but we need exemplars to know which way to go. And Tutu is one such exemplar.
Yeah, it's almost as if, and I think I may have heard him say this in this conversation that I heard him in one time, that what he's calling people to do is to live up to the status that they have of sainthood, right? That your status is not what you're creating by your action. You're living up to that. You're living into it. You're fulfilling the status that you have before God and before one another. And so since we all have that, let's all seek to live up to it instead of setting our own spirituality and bar low. Does that seem right? I mean, am I just overreading into Desmond Tutu?
No, that's right. I mean, I think we use language like be the best version of yourself. That's the same kind of, I think you're right, of message Tutu would give to anyone, to simply try to live into your calling, your vocation. As a Christian, he believes that nobody can earn their way into heaven. That's only by grace. So what he's trying to, or can't go the other extreme and make excuses for not being who we should be. So that's the danger of being against the concept of sainthood, is to say, well, I'm not Mother Teresa or I'm not
Right.
Jesus or something like that, to give an excuse to behave the way we want to behave. Left to our own devices, we kind of live in an anarchic world.
Yeah.
So we have to guard against that as well.
Right, because if we play that game, well, I'm not so and so. I'm not Mother Teresa. I'm not Desmond Tutu. I'm not the Dalai Lama. I'm not Jesus. Like if it just stayed there, that would be one thing, but it doesn't. It then goes to, well, I'm not my sister or my brother, or I'm not that other employee, or I'm not the person down the road who did that is an approach to letting oneself set aside an obligation that they might be being called into. Right? There's a curious thing when any of us play that role of, I'm not quite the right circumstance to make that happen. And this is one of the big questions in society, and historians ask this. Are there great leaders and great people historically, or are there only great moments that create great leaders? And that's actually a real question that people ask. And strangely, when you share it with people, folks fall on different sides of that, even sort of intuitively. They didn't even know they had an opinion about it, but all of a sudden there's an opinion. Do you have a thought about that? And do you have a thought about that when it comes to Desmond Tutu?
Yeah, and let me just give you this example. This will sort of give a microcosm of what I'm going to try to say on a macro level. I was watching Saturday Night Live the other night, and there was a singer, and her backup singers were better than the lead singer. And the epiphany that came to me is that the ones who are really great, the greatest people really are the ones that we don't even know about. And I think this helps me to get out of the dilemma that you presented in terms of being a great leader and how do you know that? Because I think the ones that are really doing the greatest work are doing it for the sake of the world, or doing this really in the relationship for those that they are serving. And they have learned in their spirituality to actually resist being in the limelight, because that actually can mess up the reciprocity of the person that they're helping to also be great. And so to me, those backup singers,
Wow.
they're making the person standing up front look great. And I'm not saying they need to stay backup singers. Hopefully they can renew their contracts and, become really good singers. But I think a person who is a great leader, we have to redefine that out of what is currently
Nice.
being defined as leadership in the media and leadership in Hollywood, leadership in the 1% against the 99%. We need to redefine what a great leader is. I do think a great leader needs appreciation, just like what I'm saying about Tutu. But we can't create a kind of idolatry of a great leader so that we only create capitalism around that concept.
Well, that is Michael Battle, friends. He's the author of the book Desmond Tutu, A Spiritual Biography of South Africa's Confessor. He's a professor of church and society and director of the Desmond Tutu Center at General Theological Seminary. If you're trying to find your own spirituality and you like what Desmond Tutu does or what Michael Battle has said here, well, you should look at the Episcopal Church in America, especially there in New York City. And I have a good friend who's the bishop in Washington, D.C., Marianne Buddy. So if you're in D.C., go to the Episcopal Church there. There's some really great people doing really spectacular things, and there's a path of spirituality that could be waiting you. Michael, thank you for the book. Thanks for being a part of this. We ask people to make the common good their commitment to their lives and the commitment to their civic life and to their voting life and to everything. And your description of Desmond Tutu's life is, I think, one of those arguments that the common good is recognizable when we see it. So thank you so much for being with us today, and good luck with the book, friends. And I hope you pick it up wherever you can find these books. Thanks again. Friends, we'll see you tomorrow. It's Politics Day on Tuesdays. Oh, you bet. You bet. Thanks again. Hey, friends, Tuesday on Vote Common Good is Politics Day, so you can join us for that tomorrow. But also tomorrow night, we're leading a webinar, the second of 4 installments. You don't have to have been to the first one, on the threat of Christian nationalism. And professionals who have written about Christian nationalism, Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry, have a book called Taking America Back for God. It's a critique book. They're going to be on. Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove is going to share. Stephanie Spalding, Christy Berghoff, and I are going to be hosting. We'd love to have you join us. You can go to votecommongood.com and sign up for it there. Or if you're in this stream, wherever you're watching this, if you're watching it on the socials, you will see some reminders for you to register for this. But the best place to go is to votecommongood.com. You can be in the Zoom webinar or watch it on the social stream. So we'll see you here for the podcast tomorrow morning, and then tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern, or 7 p.m. Central Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 in the Mountain, and 5 out on the Pacific Coast. We'll see you then. Thanks for being with us today.